After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
In recent months, the trade war between the U.S. and Canada has taken an unexpected turn. Trump is imposing 25% tariffs on aluminum, and this measure is just the tip of the iceberg. The Canadian government has reacted sharply to these actions, saying that they threaten not only their economy but also the very foundations of bilateral relations between the two countries. But what lies behind this decision? Why is Canada, a country with an economy stronger than ever before, having to make decisions that could change the course of events?
There's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
One of the most unexpected moves could be the use of the automotive industry, a strategic sector that provides Canada with billions of dollars in revenue and close economic ties with America. What if cars become the main trump card in this diplomatic struggle? We may see Canada restrict car exports to the U.S., which would lead to a sharp rise in car prices. The expected consequences could shake the American economy, while Canada already has a plan of action. In response to Trump's tariffs, Canada is ready to take extreme measures, and a decision will not be long in coming.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
Because, as you may have guessed, the automotive industry is not just factories and jobs, it is a huge part of the entire economic system of both countries. A simple disruption in supply could cause real chaos in the U.S. market, which is already beginning to feel the effects of the new tariffs. But Canada will not sit idly by, and its response could be far more powerful than we can imagine. What steps is Canada taking? What strategies is it using to force Trump to reconsider his tariffs? And finally, how will all this affect you, the average citizen who buys cars? We'll explore the answers to these questions in today's video. Stay with us to find out how trade wars could radically change global markets and what is behind this difficult choice by the Canadian government.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
Trade tensions between Canada and the U.S. have reached a new level with President Donald Trump's decision to impose a 25% tariff on aluminum imports. This measure was part of his America First strategy aimed at reducing U.S. dependence on foreign supplies, but the decision, which was supposed to help American manufacturers, has led to unpredictable consequences for economic relations with its neighbors. Canada, with which the U.S. has decades of mutually beneficial trade, found itself at the center of this economic storm. This is not the first time Trump has raised tariffs on goods from other countries, but for Canada, an important trading partner, such actions cannot go unanswered. Many sectors of the economy, from steel to oil and gas, are now under threat, and Canada's challenge is to find a way to respond effectively and with minimal losses.
And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
The problem becomes even more complicated when we remember that Canada is the largest supplier of aluminum and steel to U.S., with trade between the two countries reaching more than $35 billion. Although the US considers Canada a strategic ally, the constant pressure on its northern neighbor's economy is beginning to be felt at all levels. For many Canadian manufacturers, especially in the metal industry, such tariffs mean not only higher production costs, but also the threat of layoffs and consequently social instability. Canada, in turn, claims that Trump's tariffs are not just economic pressure, but a serious violation of free trade principles, and that it is ready to resort to retaliatory measures to resolve the situation.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some, and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
In response to these actions, Canadian officials expressed deep concern and stated that this decision is illegal and threatens the country's economic security. Even before the new tariffs came into force, Canadian officials began preparing for possible retaliatory measures. It has already been announced that Canada is prepared to use the automotive industry as leverage to force the US to reconsider its actions. This step was dictated not only by the importance of the automotive sector in the economies of both countries, but also by the fact that automobiles have become one of Canada's largest exports to the US. Approximately $65 billion annually comes from exports of cars and auto parts, making the automotive sector strategically important to both economies.
That's a 10. That's a good one. Yeah.
But what if Canada, as local experts have warned, decides to use this as a means of pressure on the US? In that case, the US could face a serious crisis in its automotive industry. Restrictions on car supplies, especially due to high tariffs on steel and aluminum, could significantly slow down production in the US itself, increase car prices, and cause consumer discontent, which would hit the economy. This move by Canada would not only be a response to the tariffs, but also a powerful lever to pressure the US to reconsider its position on tariffs. In this context, it is important to note that Canadian companies have also been affected by the tariff increases, as higher prices for raw materials such as steel and aluminum will inevitably affect production costs and, consequently, the competitiveness of Canadian manufacturers. However, despite its expressed dissatisfaction and desire for revenge, Canada is not ready to completely sever trade relations. Canadian officials argue that trade relations with the US are important for both countries and that a compromise solution must be found that would preserve the stability of relations and minimize economic damage. For many years, Canada has built its economy with a focus on its southern neighbors, which has created a certain dependence on foreign trade with the US. But Trump's tariffs are forcing Canadian politicians to consider diversifying their trade ties and not relying solely on one partner.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
Canada is now at a crossroads. On one side, there's a willingness to go for economic tension and use the auto industry as leverage against the US. On the other, there's a desire to keep things stable and find a diplomatic solution. The situation isn't just delicate, it's critical. The question is not only how Canada will respond, but also how the US will perceive these steps. If Canada begins to restrict car shipments or impose additional tariffs on US products, it will signal that the US and Canada could be headed for a serious economic war, the consequences of which will be felt for a long time to come. Whatever the outcome, one thing is clear. In this trade battle, The winner will be the one who proves more flexible in finding solutions. Canada may be willing to sacrifice something in the short term for long-term success in the negotiations. Meanwhile, despite its power, the US will face consequences that could severely slow down its economy and cause a wave of discontent among its citizens. After the introduction of a 25% tariff on aluminum, Canadian officials expressed their clear dissatisfaction, and the situation began to heat up. Trump made a decision that was far from expected, given the long-standing trade friendship between the two countries. The increase in tariffs to 50% came as a surprise to Canada, and questions immediately arose about the legality of such a decision. Canadian specialists and experts stated that these actions were not only illegal but also threatened stability in both countries. Officials in Canada began discussing how to respond to Trump's move and what needed to be done to not only protect their economic interests, but also minimize the damage to Canadian workers and manufacturing companies. These conversations did not remain behind closed doors. The very next morning after the tariffs were announced, Canadian officials said they were considering retaliatory measures. At first, they proposed diplomatic channels for discussion. However, as time went on, Canada began to develop more decisive steps. One of the most serious steps was proposed by representatives of the Canadian auto industry. "We cannot afford to be strangled by economic pressure," said one leading Canadian economist, considering the possibility of increasing retaliatory tariffs on US goods, including cars. Canadian officials quickly realized that the auto sector could be a decisive element in this standoff. After all, Canada had successfully exported its products to the US market in the past, and the level of car and auto parts shipments between the two countries was exceptionally high. Canadian cars, from classic models to new electric vehicles, brought billions of dollars into the country's budget every year. The value of these shipments amounted to about $65 billion per year. At the same time, the automotive industry played a strategic role in the economy, occupying an important place in exports.
U.S. President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
Thus, if Canada decides to use the automotive sector in response to Trump's tariffs, this could deal a powerful blow to the US. For example, if Canada restricts car supplies or raises export tariffs, this will immediately affect car prices within the US. American cars and their components are already becoming more expensive due to high metal prices, and further increases in car prices will lead to consumer dissatisfaction. And given that the US auto market accounts for a large share of the economy, it is possible that such measures could cause widespread discontent among Americans, which would increase political pressure on Trump. In this situation, the US risks another crisis in the auto industry. However, it will not be easy for Canada to take such measures. A complete refusal to supply cars would mean not only a deterioration in relations with the US, but also internal problems for Canada itself. A decline in production, higher car prices, and the likelihood of layoffs in car companies would all have significant consequences for the economy. Canada understands that such a move would not lead to an immediate improvement in the situation, but it could send an important signal to the US. Strong economic pressure could force the US to reconsider its tariff policy and start negotiations with Canada. Meanwhile, Trump himself continued to confidently defend his position. The US president was not ready to compromise, and his statement that tariffs were the only way to protect American jobs continued to echo across America. However, despite his assertions, questions began to arise in the US itself. Representatives of many large car companies, such as General Motors and Ford, had already stated that higher tariffs on steel and aluminum would make cars significantly more expensive, which could lead to a decline in consumer demand for new cars. This created additional difficulties for the US president, as even his supporters began to express dissatisfaction with the policy that could hurt the domestic market.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
Canada, for its part, continued to analyze the situation, taking into account all possible consequences. The whole world watched to see how the conflict would unfold, and economists predicted that Canada's response could seriously affect the U.S. Ultimately, these measures could have dealt not only an economic blow to Trump, but also a political one, which in turn would have put him so in a difficult position. Undoubtedly, the tariff dispute between Canada and the U.S. was taking on a whole new dimension that could affect the long-term stability of both countries' economies. Thus, Canada's decision to use the automotive sector as a means of pressure on the U.S. is not an easy or straightforward one. However, in the current climate of political and economic tension, it could be an important move in response to Trump's aggressive policy. The question remains, can Canada really use this leverage to change the U.S. position? Or will this conflict lead to an even greater economic crisis that will affect both countries? In response to the tariff increases, Canada continues to chart its own course in this economic standoff, demonstrating its willingness to take significant steps. As part of its strategy, it is prepared to raise the stakes to force the U.S. to reconsider its aggressive policies. Canadian officials make no secret of the fact that they are prepared to pay the price for putting pressure on the U.S., and even if the economic situation worsens, the country will continue to insist on its interests. One of the most painful blows for the U.S. could be Canada's introduction of new tariffs on cars and other important goods. Possible restrictions on car exports to the U.S. are already being discussed, which, according to analysts, could cause a real economic collapse for the American market. Experts predict that such measures will have inevitable consequences for car prices, leading to higher costs and a shortage of supply, which in turn will create a crisis in the market. This could not only cause discontent among consumers, but also lead to growing dissatisfaction among American manufacturers, who are already facing the consequences of high tariffs on steel and aluminum. Canada, for its part, understands that such measures will lead to serious domestic economic losses, but it is willing to take the risk for the sake of long-term benefits. There is already talk of a possible increase in tariffs on imports from the U.S., which in turn would make life difficult, not only for manufacturers but also for consumers. Given the importance of the automotive industry to both countries, this step would be an important signal that Canada is not willing to bow to economic pressure. Canada remains committed to avoiding conflict and hopes that such measures will serve as a catalyst for diplomatic negotiations. However, Canadian officials are confident that such a move would be painful for the U.S. and would serve as a catalyst for deeper discussions on trade relations. If Canada decides to restrict car exports, it will not only hurt the U.S. economy but also create new challenges for relations between the two countries. The losses for the U.S. could be huge. Car prices will go up, and consumer demand will drop, which will make people unhappy and have political consequences for Trump. And considering how important the auto industry is to the U.S. economy, any disruption in this sector could have negative consequences in other industries, from jobs to inflation. But the more the U.S. resists, the more the confrontation will intensify. Canada could resort to more aggressive measures, including restricting oil supplies, which could significantly increase gasoline prices in the U.S. and create additional economic problems. As the largest supplier of crude oil to the U.S., Canada has this leverage, which, if used, would seriously complicate life for Americans already facing rising fuel prices. This would lead to higher car prices, a deepening economic crisis, and discontent among broad sections of the population. Of course, a move such as cutting oil supplies would not be taken without considering the long-term consequences for Canada itself. The understanding that such measures could cause economic difficulties in the country itself makes this strategy quite risky. However, if Trump's aggressive policy continues, Canada may find itself in a situation where such measures become necessary to protect its interests. Canadian officials say they are prepared to accept certain economic losses in order to force the U.S. to reconsider its position. This largely underscores Canada's determination to use any leverage it has to achieve its goals. The new round in the trade war with the U.S. is also forcing Canada to look for alternative markets for its goods. Canadian oil companies have already begun to actively develop new directions to reduce their dependence on the U.S., focusing on regions such as Asia, Europe, and Mexico. These steps are becoming an important part of a long-term strategy that will allow Canada to strengthen its position on the international stage by reducing its dependence on a single key trading partner. However, such measures will take time. In the meantime, Canada is actively using its leverage to put pressure on the US, preparing for possible long-term negotiations that may begin after the new tariffs are introduced. The question of how the US will respond to Canada's actions remains open. The US authorities will likely seek diplomatic solutions to the conflict, but Trump is unlikely to quickly abandon his aggressive trade policy. This conflict may be a continuation of a broader geopolitical struggle that will affect not only Canada but also other countries facing US tariffs. It is quite possible that the trade war between Canada and the US will escalate into a long-term conflict in which each country will try to demonstrate its strength and economic resilience. Canada's response, taking into account all possible consequences, could have a serious impact on the global economy. These events show how important trade relations are in a globalized world, where every step can trigger a chain reaction affecting not only individual industries but entire countries. The question now is how this situation will develop and what steps Canada will take to leverage its economic power on the international stage.